Okay, welcome to this exam walkthrough for History Around Us, Helmsley Castle. This walkthrough refers to the November 2021 paper. So just a reminder that these are the criteria that questions are set around for Helmsley Castle. So if you want to read them in more detail, just pause it so you can see some of the kind of things that the questions will always focus on. And just a reminder, when you do the exam, you will complete two 25-mark exam questions from a choice of 3. The reason why they're worth 25 marks is it's 20 marks for the essay plus 5 marks for SPAG. You have 1 hour, so that gives you basically half an hour for each question. So choose your questions carefully. Make sure you do the 2 ones that you will find most easy to answer about Helmsley Castle. Now, some advice in choosing a time period. Some questions will say that they want you to choose a time period. So if you do, try and think of time periods for Helmsley such as the era of the De Roos family, maybe the 13th century or the 14th century. You could even combine them together because there is that increased domestication during that time. Maybe talk about the Walter Speck castle, the early castle, Tudor times, the era of the English Civil War. So just have in mind that slide, which I'm going to show you next, on all the different time periods so you can be aware of that. If you do get a question which asks you to name a time period, make it really clear what time period you've chosen in a brief introduction, such as the time period I've chosen is during the middle of the 17th century during the English Civil War. So that's a bit of advice on time periods. Once you've chosen your time period, you can only write about this time period. You will not get marked for anything you write about that's not within this time period. There is no specified time limit for a time period. Obviously, you don't want to have a time period that is like 700 years long. So it could be relatively short or it could be actually be quite long. But just be really clear on time periods as part of your revision. Okay, and there's just a reminder of that timeline slide. So just be really sort of confident and really aware of those different sort of stages in the development of Helmsley Castle's history. That's a really, really important piece of advice for the exam. So this is your guide on how to answer Helmsley Castle questions. Remember, you're looking for 3 sustained explanations here to get to the top of the level, and sustained explanation means you're going to include detailed and specific knowledge, analysis and explanation, and then really importantly, links to site and source evidence as well. Within, in terms of using physical site evidence, it's worth 10 of the 20 marks, so it's absolutely crucial that you do that. One of the big pieces of advice as well in answering Helmsley Castle is to make sure you decode the question carefully so that you are really clear on what it's asking you to do. So take your time, highlight key points like we've looked at in class, and make sure you link back to the question in your answer as well. Okay, so we're going to debrief the actual questions for this exam now. So in terms of these questions, the most popular question for this paper, I think everyone would probably do this one. It's quite a straightforward question. How far have the uses of your site changed throughout its history? So let's just decode this question now. So when we decode this question, how far means you should consider the extent of the change, including whether things stayed the same. So there's an opportunity really to write about change in continuity. When it says throughout its history, means you should focus on the different stages of your castle, and the best answers for this question cover the whole time period from a spec right to the present day being owned by English Heritage. And you're going to focus on major changes and turning points. It'd be difficult to do this question without writing about the English Civil War. So you need to have that kind of overview and sense of some of the big changes. You know, it's military purpose at the start, but then going on to sort of like feasts, you know, the purpose of religion, domestic, particularly in the 13th and 14th centuries, showing off power. Obviously that huge turning point of the English Civil War being again used for military reasons, and then its decline post sort of the English Civil War in terms of falling into a romantic ruin, and then what its purpose is in the sort of 20th and 21st century as a heritage and tourist site. Obviously, you need to include specific and relevant knowledge. You must refer to site evidence, so all the time thinking about what that site evidence tells you, and also what you can actually learn from that site evidence. And remember, don't make any sort of silly mistakes over literacy. So don't, for example, forget to include things like capital letters for Helmsley Castle. That's going to just cost you SPAG marks straight away. So we'll just read through an example of this question. So you can see here I've color coded it, and we'll do throughout the sort of feedback here. So green is your knowledge, yellow is use of site evidence, sort of that bluey colour is historical language and referring back to second order concepts, and the purple is making clear links back to the question, which will usually be at the start and end of paragraphs. So let's have a look at this first paragraph. The uses of the site have changed greatly throughout its history. Helmsley Castle was first built in the early 12th century by Walter Speck. When it was first built, it was for a military purpose. Walter Speck was a powerful military man who was also a royal justiciar. Source evidence shows this, as St. Aelred described Walter Speck at the Battle of Standard in 1138 as a powerful man with a voice like a trumpet and limbs of unparalleled size. This shows that he was the sort of person who would have built a castle for a military reason in order to control his lands. Site evidence allows us to conclude this. The double ditch earthworks created by Speck are still visible today and underline its military purpose. In addition, the location of the site on a rocky and high outcrop overlooking the town of Helmsley shows that the castle was built for military reasons. However, towards the later Middle Ages, the use of the castle changed greatly from this military use to a more domestic use. In the 14th century, additions were made to the open-backed barbican, that's the South Barbican by the way, to turn it into accommodation for the constable. Site evidence helps us to understand this. Today we can see the physical remains of a fireplace, latrines and rooms for the constable to live in, reflecting the increased size and military purpose of the castle. Today we can see physical evidence of the large Great Hall, extension of the West Tower where the de Roos family lived, and additions of the kitchens, buttery and pantry which were all added in the 14th century. This shows an increasing domestic purpose of the castle from its originally military purpose between the 12th and 14th century. Paragraph 2. In some ways, the use of the site have remained the same. For example, there is continuity in the domestic purpose of the castle, which stayed the same between the 14th and the 16th century. In the northwest of the castle, we can see today the physical remains of the brewhouse and bakehouse, which reflect the domestic purpose of the castle. Historians believe these were added in the 15th or early 16th century. Furthermore, in the 16th century, the Manners family took control of the castle from the de Roos family. A big change to the castle took place in that a Tudor mansion was built by Edward Manners. There is much site evidence that remains within the old medieval chamber block next to the West Tower. Here we can see the remains of the Tudor mansion, which is well preserved both externally and internally. In fact, we can see the ornamental plasterwork and friezes within the old hall of the Tudor mansion, which reflects the continued domestic use of the castle. Furthermore, we can see the footings for the loggia and the remains of a Tudor long gallery. Both these architectural features were typical of Elizabethan mansions, and we can infer the mansion was built for comfortable living and to show off the wealth of the Manners family. This reflects a continuation in Helmsley Castle being used for a domestic purpose. However, the use of the castle also changed within Tudor times. The chapel was no longer being used due to its links to Catholicism after the Reformation, and was converted into a kitchen. This reflects the changing importance of religion from medieval times into Tudor times. Paragraph 3. By far the biggest turning point in the history of Helmsley Castle was the impact of the English Civil War. This led to a huge change in the uses of the site, as it meant that Helmsley Castle was being used for an active military purpose for the very first time in its history. Between August and November 1644, there was a siege at Helmsley Castle with the Royalist forces led by Jordan Crossland holding out against parliamentary forces led by Sir Thomas Fairfax. After a 3-month siege, a surrender with honour was agreed. The source evidence of the surrender document tells us the Royalist forces were allowed to leave the castle with their weapons, and they travelled to Scarborough Castle. As a result of the surrender, the East Tower was slighted, which was a pivotal and long-lasting change to the castle. Site evidence clearly demonstrates the impact of the blast, as we can still see the ruined East Tower today with the rubble in the ditch, allowing us to reconstruct the huge impact this had on the castle. With the castle now being ruined, it led to another change in the use of the site, as it could not be used again for a military purpose. Although during the Second World War, Helmsley Castle was going to be used as an anti-tank defence, the English Civil War was the only time the castle saw active military use. The slighting of the castle led to a long-term change in that it fell into disrepair and ruin, having a variety of uses such as being used in the 19th century as a tennis court and to host village pageants and political meetings, like the Primrose League, for example. From the 20th century and today, the castle is now used as a tourist and heritage site, demonstrating another big change in its use. The museum and displays present site evidence for this modern-day use, enabling tourists and historians to enjoy the site and learn about the history of this fascinating building. So you can see that we've got a big influence on change and continuity, and that answer covers the whole time period, really being aware of changes and continuity throughout, and that's how you would do that question. So the second question said, explain why your site was important nationally and or locally. You can focus on one period or several periods in the history of the site. So you've actually got quite a lot of flexibility for this question. You can look at its importance nationally or locally, or you could write about both. And very much this question links to the second order concept of historical significance. This question gives you freedom here on time periods, so it's probably easier to actually look at 3 different time periods rather than just one. Make sure you include specific and relevant knowledge, refer to site evidence, and make sure that you are focusing on SPAG as well. Okay, so I would actually start this essay off by looking at Walter of Spec. So let's read the example answer, and again, look out for the site evidence, which is colour-coded in yellow. Helmsley Castle was significant locally when it was built by Walter of Spec in the early 1120s. The building of the castle in 1120 was important for allowing Walter of Spec to control his lands. Walter of Spec was both a locally and nationally significant individual who was responsible for defeating the Scots at the Battle of Standard in 1138. Source evidence demonstrates he was a powerful military leader, with St Ilrid of Riva Abbey describing him as having a voice like a trumpet and limbs of unparalleled size. Spec must have been trusted by King Henry I, as he was given vast lands in the north and was a royal justiciar. He also served as High Sheriff of Yorkshire under King Stephen, demonstrating his significance both locally and nationally. Therefore, his choice of building Helmsley Castle demonstrates its importance locally. Site evidence can reinforce the importance of this early castle. Although it's a challenge to fully know what the early castle looked like, we can still see site evidence of the very distinctive double-ditch earthworks. This suggests that Helmsley Castle was more powerfully defended than other nearby castles such as Pickering Castle, underlining its local importance. We know the site had 2 baileys, and there was a remaining wall close to the West Tower, which is one of the only surviving bits of site evidence from this era. We can use site evidence to understand his choice of building a castle on a rocky outcrop overlooking Helmsley, allowing us to conclude the castle would have been very significant locally. Furthermore, Spec found Riva Abbey and Kirkham Priory nearby in the 1130s, underlining his significance to the local area in Yorkshire in establishing religious houses. A statue of a Spec holding a sword and a castle can be seen at Beverley Minster, underlining his lasting importance to Yorkshire. This all demonstrates how significant the building of the early castle was to both the town of Helmsley and Yorkshire. Furthermore, Helmsley Castle was significant both locally and nationally in the 14th century. The 14th century saw huge changes in Helmsley Castle as it became more domestic. The lords of Helmsley would have had many retainers, which were members of the lower nobility who would have been loyal to the lords of Helmsley, and therefore more accommodation was needed. One such important change was the heightening of the East Tower in the early part of the 14th century. This was a significant event locally, and site evidence reveals the sheer height and the scale of the tower, and the fact that distinctive ear turrets were put onto the tower, similar to those at the Beauchamp Tower at the Tower of London, reflects the importance of the castle locally for projecting the power of the de Roos family. The castle must have also been seen as being significant nationally because King Edward III visited the castle in 1334. Furthermore, the castle saw many additions in the 14th century, which reflects its growing importance to the local community. We can see site evidence to help us understand this. Wing walls are added to link the South Barbican to the rest of the castle. Meanwhile, the gateway at the South Barbican was filled in, and a study of the different coloured sandstone helps reveal this. In addition, the South Barbican was made into a proper residential building, and it's believed it was the home of the constable. Site evidence reveals a latrine and fireplace, suggesting the accommodation was comfortable. An inquisition of 1343 suggests the castle was in good repair and well looked after, again suggesting the castle was important to the local community. Okay, now you're definitely going to want to write about the English Civil War as well for this question. It's going to be a key element of analysis. So let's look at this third paragraph. Helmsley Castle was highly significant both locally and nationally during the English Civil War. In 1644, Yorkshire was the stronghold of the Royalists within the English Civil War, and Helmsley was garrisoned by royal forces under the command of the steward Jordan Crosland. 1644 was a turning point in the English Civil War, and Helmsley Castle was at the heart of this. Between August 1644 and November 1644, there was a siege at Helmsley Castle. Prior to this, the parliamentary forces had broken the siege at York by defeating them at the Battle of Marston Moor. Site evidence can reveal the story of the siege with artefacts such as cannon shot being found in the grounds of the castle. However, a lack of lots of distinctive pockmarks in the remaining walls suggests that most of these would have been fired to make loud noises and intimidate. An unexploded mortar bomb has also been found and is on display at the museum in the castle. This helps to reveal the story of what happened to the East Tower in November 1644, when the East Tower was slighted by a similar mortar bomb. This happened after the surrender with honour, and where it was agreed that the castle walls would be brought down and the East Tower slighted so it could never be used again as a military fortress. The site evidence of remaining rubble in the ditch helps us to understand the significance of the slighting of the East Tower, and what a dramatic change this would have been, underlining the significance of the event. The partially destroyed East Tower is site evidence that reveals the sheer scale of this event. The bringing down of the East Tower and the castle walls must have been extremely loud and dramatic and would have led to a huge and significant change in the physical appearance of the castle. This is one of the most significant events in the history of Helmsley Castle, but is also significant nationally in allowing Parliament to establish further control of Yorkshire and eventually win the English Civil War. Therefore, a study of Helmsley Castle can reveal the story, one of the most significant turning points of the English Civil War. Okay, so the third question was, how far does your site enable historians to understand the everyday life and attitudes of people who lived there? Again, there's no restrictions on time periods here, so it's very much a focus on looking at different pieces of site evidence and thinking about what this can show you. So how far it requires you to sort of have that balanced response, and you can sort of think about a range of different reasons really about how the site can help you to understand the everyday life and attitudes. It's a broad question, so you can answer questions about how society works, what pastimes and customs they had, include specific and relevant knowledge, refer to site evidence, remember to be careful with SPAG, and just remember there's no parameter here in terms of time period, which is always useful as well. So let's have a look at the first example. So the first paragraph, you could say, the remains of the chapel reveal the attitudes and values of people in the 14th century. The chapel was built by the 13th century and was consecrated in 1246 and was still have been a really important part of castle life by the 14th century. An inquisition upon the death of William de Roos III in 1343 reveals that a chaplain was employed by the castle, demonstrating the importance of religion to the attitudes and values of those living at Helmsley Castle in the 14th century. Site evidence of the chapel can be used to show that there were doorways in the north and south walls and a third doorway at the southwest corner. The chapel may have contained a gallery where the de Roos family observed Mass, showing that even in services the importance of the de Roos family as Lords of Helmsley was maintained. We can infer that religion was important as archaeological evidence of glazed roof tiles and ornamental floor tiles have been found. There remains today a moulded jamb of an ornate window at the site, which again reveals the importance of religion at the site. Historians can therefore infer the existence of a chaplain, and a sizable chapel reveals the importance of Christianity to those living at the castle during the medieval era of the de Roos family. Historians can also use site evidence to understand the leisure activities of those in the 14th century, particularly in terms of the importance of hunting and feasts. In the 14th century, there were extensive improvements made to the kitchen range area of the castle, which is located against the curtain walls on the south side of the castle. At the site, we can see the remains of the Great Hall built in the 14th century. Its extensive size points to the importance of the Great Hall and projecting the power of the de Roos family and hinting at its use. It also shows a move to a more domestic purpose of the castle. The Great Hall was used for entertaining people at feasts. Site evidence around the site has uncovered evidence of extensive arrowheads found, which is a reminder of hunting that took place at Helmsley Castle throughout medieval times. The park to the west was called La Haye and now makes up the grounds of Duncan Park. The sheer size of the estates can be seen today, and we can conclude that Helmsley Castle was deliberately set in these grounds, reinforcing the importance of hunting and feasting in medieval times, including the 14th century. The Great Hall presumably replaced another hall, but the width of the room and the site evidence of buttresses against wall suggest the building was aisled. It was set up with the de Roos family sitting on a raised platform called a dais, which allows us to conclude that feasts helped reinforce the social hierarchy and projected the power of the Lords of Helmsley. This reveals a key value of the time. There is no evidence of a fireplace, so we conclude the room would have been heated by a central hearth with a louvre allowing smoke to escape. This site evidence helps us to conclude the increased domestication of Helmsley Castle at this time, and the importance of hunting and feast and understanding everyday lives and attitudes. Okay, paragraph 3. Finally, in the 13th and 14th century, the East Tower was heightened and extended as well as the West Tower. This reinforces the increased size of households and retainers during this time period. There were simply more people living and working in the castle during this era. A key piece of site evidence is that a change in the stonework of the East Tower can reveal how the East Tower was heightened at the start of the 14th century. This was in order to project the power of the de Roos family and reveals the importance of the castle building to project the military power. This shows a key attitude of the time was that castles and estates were used to project power in a hierarchical society. Historians believe the heightening of the East Tower was done in advance of a visit by King Edward III to the castle in 1334. Distinctive decorative ear turrets were put onto the castle, which are very similar to those at the Beauchamp Tower at the Tower of London. This reveals that Lords of Helmsley wanted the East Tower to project power and underline the importance of the castle, demonstrating a key attitude of people at the time. The East Tower is the key symbol of the power of Helmsley Castle and can be seen for miles around. It underlines the importance of the Lords of Helmsley ruling the local area. The East Tower is often used for the business of the castle and to hear legal cases, and this again reveals the power of the Lords of Helmsley within Helmsley and the surrounding area. The fact that even today the East Tower can be seen for miles around and from the town of Helmsley reinforces that importance of social hierarchy in the castle for projecting power in medieval times. Therefore, the East Tower reveals key historical questions about life and attitudes of people in the 14th century. So within that answer, we've kind of tended to focus on the same time period, but of course you could have written about any sort of time period there. You know, the Tudor times would have been a good one in terms of talking about the Manners family and how they built the mansion to sort of show off their wealth and their power and their you know, how rich they were, for example, and that was quite a distinctive feature just generally of Elizabethan life. And again, the era of the English Civil War can help us to understand the nature of the tensions in society during the English Civil War, for example, between Parliament and the Royalists. So lots of different things you can talk about for that question. Okay, so key takeaways when you're doing these questions. Remember, do decode the question carefully. Remember, cite evidence is absolutely crucial. And remember that you always need free, sustained explanation. So thanks for watching that video presentation about Helmsley Castle and the questions from the November 2021 examination. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.